Camilo was 9 years old and already carried on his shoulders a weight that many adults could not bear. Since his parents died in a car accident 2 years earlier, his life had turned to dust and silence. It was a cloudy Sunday when everything changed. He was playing with a wooden toy car in the backyard, waiting for his mother to return with fresh bread from the market. She never returned. Neither of them returned. That night, he was taken by neighbors to his aunt and uncle's house in San Buenaventura, a village where time always seemed to run more slowly, but where the coldness of those who took him in was swift, harsh, and constant. His aunt and uncle, a woman with a dry gaze and a man with a perpetually loud voice, treated him from the start as a nuisance. Without school, without toys, without affection, Camilo woke up early every day to clean the pigsty, carry buckets of water, and stack firewood. He wore clothes from another era, so worn that they seemed to disintegrate in the sea wind. No one called him by name. He was brat, useless, deadweight. Take this opportunity to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss more stories like this. We're just getting started, and there's a lot of profound stuff coming your way. Despite all this, Camilo did not harden. He had large, attentive eyes that searched for the sky, even on cloudy days. He kept in a cloth bag 3 objects that no one else knew about: a little medal from his mother, a blue button that he said he had, found on his father's lap the last time he saw him, and a crumpled note with a phrase that was no longer legible, but that he had memorized: trust, even when it hurts. Every night, even when tired, he knelt beside an old chicken coop and prayed in silence. He didn't ask for anything extravagant. He just wanted peace. Sometimes, when the night came with stars, he would whisper into the darkness, "Lord, do you see me?" The question hung in the air, unanswered, but he repeated it, because deep down, he believed that one day someone would hear. That Tuesday morning, the sky dawned heavy and the smell of rain hung in the air, but Camilo was already on his feet long before the first clouds gathered. He carried sacks of corn from the granary to his uncle's barn without complaining. He knew that if he uttered a word at the wrong time, a slipper would come flying. That's how things worked there. Silence was survival. When his uncle stormed out of the kitchen, shouting that 3 sacks of corn had disappeared, Camilo only had time to turn his head. There were no questions, no explanations, no room for innocence. He was grabbed by the arm with force and dragged to the center of the yard as if he were a criminal. His aunt appeared with a piece of stick, and amid the screams and the neighbors' eyes peering through the cracks in the windows, they began to beat him. Camilo did not scream. He squeezed his eyes shut and thought of his mother's medal. He mentally repeated the phrase from the note as if it could protect him: trust even when it hurts. After the beating, they threw him onto the dirt floor of the barn and locked the door from the outside. Inside, with his body burning and his eyes swollen, Camilo cried for the first time in months, not out of fear nor out of pain, but out of the realization, in that moment, that no one was coming, that no one there cared whether he had stolen the sacks of corn or not. He felt erased from the world, as if his existence had been nullified. When night fell and the village fell asleep, he crawled to his hidden corner in the pigsty, grabbed the bag with his 3 objects, and left. Barefoot, wounded, his face swollen, he crossed the gate without looking back. He didn't know where he was going. He only knew he had to go. He walked through the darkness guided by a single thing: a wordless prayer, repeated only in his heart. The field where Camilo collapsed was a forgotten plot between the road and Mrs. Milagros's sunflower plantation, an elderly lady who at that hour of the night slept with 2 hens at the foot of her bed. The boy arrived staggering, his clothes torn and his face covered in dust and dried blood. He didn't know how, but he felt he could stop there. He lay down next to a fallen log and hugged the bag with his 3 objects, as if it were all he had left, and indeed it was. The night's cold began to invade his bones, but his exhaustion was greater. He dozed off between sobs, trying to repeat the phrase from the note one last time before passing out. For the first time, he felt afraid he wouldn't wake up. But even so, he didn't give up. He slept with his small chest wheezing, as if he were holding life by the wisps of faith. It was the sound of Don Silvano's rubber boots that woke him, with the sun already tinting the sky a pale orange. The old farmer, wearing a worn hat and sun-weathered skin, walked with a hoe over his shoulder and a handful of herbs in his other hand. When he saw the boy curled up on the ground, he stopped. He watched for a while in silence. It was not common to find people there, much less a child in that state. He bent down slowly, without making a fuss, and removed his hat, as one would take off their shoes before entering a sacred place. "You're alive, boy?" he asked in a hoarse but gentle voice. Camilo merely nodded, without opening his eyes. Don Silvano then recognized him. "Are you Damian's son? Rosa's?" The boy's eyes widened. It was the first time in a long time that someone had spoken his parents' names out loud. Don Silvano did not ask too many questions at that moment. He picked Camilo up in his arms as if gathering a wounded bird and carried him to his home, a simple adobe structure surrounded by free-roaming chickens and clay pots, with herbs hanging in the windows. Inside, he prepared a lukewarm bath in a deep basin, treated the wounds with comfrey leaves and castor oil, and gave the boy a thin corn porridge sweetened with brown sugar. Camilo, silent, ate slowly, watching everything with wary eyes, but for the first time in a long while he did not feel afraid. The old man seemed to know exactly what to do, with no hurry, no demands. After the bath and the meal, the boy fell asleep on a thin mattress covered with a threadbare wool blanket, to the sound of an old radio playing soft waltzes. Outside, Don Silvano rolled a straw cigarette and thought about how much the boy was the spitting image of his godfather Damian, his youth, friend with whom he had lost contact years ago. The next day, after Camilo woke up and accepted another bowl of porridge, Don Silvano sat with him under the shade of a mango tree and asked, without beating around the bush, what had happened. The boy told everything, with long pauses and a low voice, as if ashamed of feeling pain. The old man listened in silence, without interrupting, merely squinting from time to time, as if swallowing indignation along with his saliva. When Camilo finished, he took from his pocket an old cookie tin full of yellowed papers. "Your father left this with me before he left. It was for you. I never knew what it contained, but I kept it. I think now it makes sense." Inside the tin was a copy of his parents' will, the deed to the house where Camilo had lived, and a letter from Damian to Don Silvano, saying, "If anything happens to me, take care of him as if he were your own." The old man read it aloud, his voice choked, and saw Camilo's eyes fill with tears, not of sadness, but of a relief he didn't even know existed. Don Silvano was not a man of empty promises. That very afternoon, he put on his blue linen shirt, the one he wore only on important occasions, tied on his leather boots, slipped the papers into a clear plastic folder, and set off on foot toward the village center. Camilo followed him hand in hand, wearing sandals the old man had improvised from tire strips. As they passed the communal store, some residents looked on in surprise, whispering. It was rare to see Don Silvano so serious. Upon reaching the small town hall building, he asked to speak with the local scribe, who also served as the police chief and justice of the peace. He explained the situation firmly, presented the documents, and demanded that an investigation be opened. The man, a short, mustachioed fellow named Jacinto, widened his eyes upon seeing the paperwork. He knew this changed everything. "If this is true, the boy's uncles have committed usurpation," he muttered, trying to disguise his discomfort. Don Silvano simply nodded. "It is true, and it's time to do what's right." The next day, Jacinto convened an emergency meeting with the villagers and asked Camilo's uncles to appear in the church courtyard, where public meetings were held. The news spread quickly, and by the time the sun reached its zenith, almost all of San Buenaventura was there. The uncles arrived suspiciously, looking as if they had not slept well. Upon seeing Camilo next to Don Silvano, the uncle, immediately began to accuse him of being a thief, saying he had run away to escape blame. But before he could finish, a woman with a firm voice asked for the floor. It was Mercedes, who worked at the store and had seen the real thief, one of the couple's own nephews, who'd been selling corn to buy moonshine in the neighboring village. The silence that fell after the revelation was thick. For the first time, Camilo looked around and saw eyes that did not ignore him. He was there whole and was finally seen. What followed was one of those moments that seemed to change the air around you. Don Silvano handed the folder with the documents to the scribe, and Jacinto, reluctant but pressured by the community's gaze, began to read aloud the contents of the deed. Camilo's name appeared there, small but firm, as the sole legal heir to the house and the piece of land where his uncles had lived until then. Damian's letter was read next, with simple words but filled with love and trust. When it ended, the silence of the square was replaced by a murmur of astonishment, followed by an indignant buzz. The uncles, cornered, tried to say they didn't know anything, that it was all a lie, but no one believed them anymore. Jacinto himself, who had previously treated them with some deference, now looked at them with contempt. "You will answer for this," he said. Justice did not arrive with handcuffs or scandal, but with a clear weight of shame and restitution. Camilo watched it all without fully understanding what it meant, but he felt for the first time that something inside him was settling into place, as if a piece that had been out of place finally clicked. When the crowd began to disperse and his uncles were escorted out of the house that, until then, they had claimed as theirs, Don Silvano crouched before the boy and spoke softly. "You will sleep there tonight, in your bed, in your house." Camilo looked at the door, still somewhat suspicious, as if he feared it was all a mistake, but upon entering he smelled the damp wood, recognized an old photograph of his parents atop a dresser, and without realizing it, began to cry. It wasn't sadness. It was as if all the pain he had held onto for years needed to come out at once, to make room for what was to come. That night, Camilo slept in the room that had once belonged to his parents. The mattress still smelled of storage, and the blankets were heavy, but they brought a comfort he had never known. Before lying down, he placed the bag with his 3 treasures beside the bed, the little medal, the blue button, and the crumpled note. For the first time, he took them out of the cloth and spread them carefully over the bedspread, as if setting up an altar. He stared at them for long minutes, unhurried, as if he could finally breathe easily. And there, in the silence of the room, he whispered something he didn't even know he still remembered, his mother's voice singing an old lullaby. He didn't know all the words, but he hummed what he could. That, more than any embrace, made him feel like he was coming home, not just to a place, but to himself. In the days that followed, Don Silvano became his guide. He showed him how to plant beans, how to identify armadillo tracks in the wet mud, how to milk a cow without hurting her. Camilo followed him in silence, attentive, absorbing every detail. The old man spoke little, but when he did, he was direct. "You are not less than anyone else." "Understood," he would repeat. And Camilo, little by little, began to believe it. The neighbors started to look at him differently. Mrs. Milagros gave him a new shirt she had made herself. Mercedes brought old books and offered to help him with reading. For the first time, someone asked, "What do you like to do?" And he did not know how to answer. No one had ever cared. But he began to discover. He liked to draw on the ground with sticks, to listen to Don Silvano's stories, and to write loose words in a little notebook that Mercedes had given him. He was learning to exist again, only this time the right way. Over time, Camilo began to speak more. At first, short sentences, almost whispers. But Don Silvano listened to everything attentively, as if every word were too important to go unnoticed. One day, while they were tending a fence, the boy said that on the worst days with his uncles, he used to converse with God in his thoughts, asking if anyone could see him. Don Silvano was quiet, for a moment wiping sweat from his forehead with the grimy handkerchief he carried in his pocket. "I think God answers through people," he said without looking up. Camilo was silent, digesting that. For the first time, the idea that his prayer had been heard, even if not in the way he expected, made sense. It was as if everything he had been through had led him there, to that moment, with that old man with calloused hands and precise words. That week, a team from the state government arrived in the village to register complaints of child labor and verify land irregularities. Don Silvano presented Camilo's story and the documents, and the neighbors themselves confirmed the mistreatment the boy had suffered. The uncles were officially notified and included in an investigation. Camilo's name was recognized as the legitimate heir, and the land was registered in his name with legal support. When Jacinto, now more accommodating and ashamed, handed the new document to the boy, he didn't know what to say. He just stared at the paper with a kind of respect that only someone who has been denied everything can feel. That night, before going to sleep, he opened his little notebook and wrote, "Today I own my story." Those were the first words he had written without copying from anyone, and for the first time, he felt that the phrase was his and that no one could take that away from him. With the new registration in hand, Don Silvano began to teach Camilo how to tend the land like a true owner, but without arrogance, with respect. He explained that the land responded to the care it received, just like people. Camilo liked hearing that. He began to realize that planting was more than just throwing seeds into the ground. It was a kind of conversation, and each sprout that emerged seemed to answer his silent questions. The garden was the first thing they cultivated together: cilantro, onions, cassava, all simple but done with care. Sometimes neighbors would come by to buy produce, and the boy learned to make change, to say thank you without lowering his eyes. It wasn't about money, it was about dignity, about being treated as someone who has worth, and he was finally beginning to see himself that way. Despite this, not every day was easy. There were nights when fear returned out of nowhere. Memories of the past appeared like ghosts, especially when the wind blew hard or someone spoke loudly. At those times, Camilo would squeeze the blue button in his hand and hide under the blanket. Don Silvano never pressured him. He just left a glass of warm milk on the bedside table and said, "It will pass." And it did. Not because time heals, but because now he had a place where it was safe to feel. One day, while they were working in the chicken coop, Camilo asked if he could plant a tree in the yard. "Why?" asked the old man. "To remind me that I stayed, and that now no one can take me from here anymore." Don Silvano just nodded, a small smile hidden beneath his sparse mustache. Together they planted a guava tree, and the boy wrote his name on a little wooden plaque. He nailed it there, into the earth, his permanence. If this story has made you think of someone, share it with that person. Sometimes, a story like this arrives at just the right moment and changes someone's day. Gradually, the house came back to life. Camilo cleaned the old portraits, patched torn curtains with Mercedes's help, and set up a shelf just for his special objects. The cloth bag stayed with him, but now it remained open, as if it no longer needed to be hidden. One day, he found at the bottom of a drawer an old prayer book belonging to his mother, its cover torn and the pages stained with fingerprints. He began to read it before bed, in a low voice, as if sharing secrets with someone who was still listening. He also started writing little letters to God, not requests, but thank you notes. "Today, I harvested the first cassava. Today, Silvano called me son without realizing it. Today, I managed to smile even with longing." It was like creating a new dialogue with a God whom he now knew answered, not aloud, but through gestures, encounters, and roots. One afternoon, a group of children passed in front of the house. They were going fishing at the river and invited Camilo to join. He hesitated, suspicious. He wasn't used to invitations. Don Silvano appeared in the doorway and said simply, "Go. You deserve to play too." Camilo ran to the riverbank with the others, carrying nothing but his little notebook in his pocket. They laughed, slipped in the mud, invented games and shared pieces of guava paste on wax paper. For the first time, Camilo laughed out loud, without fear. When he returned home, wet and with dirty feet, Don Silvano pretended to scold him, but handed him a dry towel and a piece of buttered bread. That night, before going to sleep, Camilo wrote, "Today God answered me with laughter," and he slept with a full heart. He had not forgotten what he had been through, but now he knew that pain was not destiny. It was just part of the journey. At school, Camilo was enrolled with Mercedes's support, who knew the principal and explained the situation. The first days were difficult. He didn't know how to read properly, wrote slowly, and was afraid of making mistakes. He sat at the back of the class, quiet, trying not to draw attention. But the teacher, a patient woman named Marilia, soon realized that the silence hid a lot. She began leaving notes in his notebook. "You can do it. Your handwriting is beautiful. Keep trying." Camilo kept each one as if they were medals. One day, during a writing assignment, he wrote about the guava tree he had planted with Don Silvano. He read it aloud, his voice trembling but firm. When he finished, the class applauded. He didn't know what to do. He felt like running away. But the teacher came to him, knelt beside his desk, and said, "You have a story that the world needs to hear." That was etched into his soul. Share in the comments what you're feeling so far. Each story like this carries something that touches each person differently. Your perspective might inspire someone. On the way back home that day, Camilo walked more upright. He felt lighter, as if he now carried not only his own story, but the right to tell it. Don Silvano was waiting for him at the gate, his hands dirty with earth and a broad smile on his face. "So?" he asked. Camilo did not answer with words, simply hugged the old man tightly. Then they sat on the porch bench and ate freshly picked guavas. The late afternoon light made the yard golden, and the guava tree already had new leaves. "I think she likes her new home," said the boy, looking at the tree. Don Silvano laughed, "Just like you." And in that moment, without needing to say anything more, Camilo understood that something inside him had also taken root. That pain existed, yes, but now it shared space with hope, and that was enough. A few weeks later, Camilo returned alone to the old house where he had been mistreated. The door was locked and the windows were dusty. No sign of his uncles, who had left the village in haste after the complaint. He stood there for a while, watching the yard where he had so often cried in hiding. He walked to the old chicken coop, knelt on the ground, and buried the cloth bag he had always carried. Before covering it with soil, he carefully took out the three objects: the little medal, the blue button, and the note. He put the note in his shirt pocket. The other two he placed in a small cloth bundle and left them with the earth, as one does when burying the past. Not to forget, but to stop carrying the weight. When he finished, he stood looking at the sky. "Thank you for not forgetting me," he said. And for the first time, he felt that the answer came immediately. The wind blew gently, like a caress on his face. And so Camilo returned home with steady steps. The guava tree was already bearing small fruit, and Don Silvano was waiting with a glass of juice in hand. They sat, as always, in silence, watching the end of the afternoon. Now, he was no longer the invisible boy of the village. He was the owner of his own land, of his own words, and of his own destiny. He had scars, yes, but he also had roots. He learned that justice may take time, but it arrives. That faith, even when silent, can move the impossible, and that sometimes all we need is someone who sees who we are when the world insists on erasing us. Today, Camilo continues writing in his little notebook, now nearly full, and when asked how everything changed, he replies without thinking, "On the day God answered me with a stubborn old man, a guava tree, and a house that was mine from the beginning. And before you go, hit the bell to receive the next stories. Each tale here is made to move and reflect alongside you.